This is the Modhouse Tungsten, and it is the second coming of the legendary Hi-Fi Man HE6. It needs some serious amping to run it properly, but if you can, it's quite the experience. In fact, it won our Open Back Headphone of the Year for 2023. And in this video, I'm going to talk about it. Just a disclaimer, this unit was sent over by Ryan from Modhouse for review. I do not get to keep it, I do not get paid to say anything in particular about it, and all thoughts and opinions here are my own. Big thanks to Ryan for sending it in for review. My bias with this one is that Ryan is someone who I have a great deal of respect for, having met him at a number of audio shows, and we've chatted at length about headphone design, and usually to the point where everyone else has left and they're trying to shut down the event, so take that for what you will. Ryan's a great guy. So, with the Tungsten, let's go over a few things first here. This is the double-sided version, so there are two different versions. The double-sided comes in at $2,000 and the single-sided comes in at $1,500. Now, for those who don't know what I'm talking about here, these are planar magnetic headphones, and an oversimplified explanation of this is that you can have these drivers designed with magnet arrays on just one side of the diaphragm or on both sides. And the advantage of having it on both sides is that you can get more uniform movement of the diaphragm. How this plays out in practice, though, in terms of frequency response and distortion, depends on the other parameters of the headphone. So what else is going on with the driver as well. But there is a theoretical advantage to going double-sided. And with that in mind, I am only able to give commentary on the double-sided version here without having the single-sided version to compare with. I can't really comment on what the difference would be. If there's any meaningful difference to begin with. So maybe that's something for a future video. So again, just for clarity, this is the double-sided version, and that's what I'm going to be reviewing here today. Also worth noting is that this headphone has two potential pad offerings from Modhouse. The default ones are actually these perforated pads, but you can also option for the hybrid pads, which are the ones that are on here right now, and they do have an effect on the sound. You can also specify the color of the grill. This one is matte black, which I think looks great, but you can make different choices here. I think it'd be really cool if someone did like a pure white version, and then you could have like the kind of white and black contrast Stormtrooper look. That's what my car looks like. I think it looks dope. But anyways, I think this looks pretty cool as well. And interestingly, the inside of the grill, so like the underside, is made of wood, and it has a kind of woody aroma to it. I never thought I'd be describing headphones as woody, but here I am. This one smells woody. Woody headphones. Now, for the rest of the build quality here, the Tungsten definitely gives me that kind of like handmade vibe, which may or may not be a good thing depending on the person. So like it doesn't have that kind of like refinement or elegance that you might find with, say, one of the Meze headphones or like an HD 800S or something like that. And the material that's used here is kind of like a nylon type material, which is almost a little bit sort of rough to the touch. But at the same time, the whole thing does feel reasonably sturdy and robust. Like all of this feels sturdy. It just feels a little bit like it was made by a guy, because it was. For its mechanical design, you do have full cup swivel here, so these go all the way around. And then you do have extension here with the rods. There's a strap underneath. And then the top band you can actually adjust the clamp pressure by bending the top metal headband piece, which I did have to do for my giant audiophile head. Now for comfort, I did find this to be reasonable. Let me just put it on here and show you guys. So like I mentioned, I did have to bend the top headband because I did find it to be a bit clampy out of the box. And the clamp pressure is interesting. It does seem to affect the sound quality with the perf pads, but not so much with the hybrid pads. And this is something that I actually pointed out in the forum post that I did for this headphone as well, that for whatever reason with the pad deformation here, like as the pads compress, it seems to change the pad volume, and then this has an impact on the overall linearity of the sound. And in particular, the clampier it was, so the more compressed the pads got, the more linear the sound. So I think that's just something to keep in mind, that if you over loosen it, it may actually have a negative impact on the sound quality. Now for the rest of the comfort, the Tungsten is a little bit on the heavier side. Obviously I'm wearing a hat right now, so like this is not how I would wear it normally. But it does weigh around 520 grams. And the thing is, this is, again, a bit on the heavier side, but compared to other planar magnetic headphones, like double-sided planar magnetic headphones especially, this is on the lighter side of things. Like this is much lighter than what you get with the Odyssey headphones. And it's similar in weight to, if I remember correct, the Hi-Fi Man HE500. Which is a headphone that is very near and dear to my heart. So comparing the comfort of this to that of the HE6, it's similar in the sense that they're both heavy, but this one is a little bit more comfortable than the HE6. But still, I think that comfort is something that Ryan can refine a little bit with this one, with the design. I find that there's a little bit of pressure right above my temples, so maybe there's a way for the underneath strap here to be a little bit more padded, or maybe the depth could be increased or something like that. That's where I feel the strongest pressure point. But of course, this is something that's going to be different for every person. I just wanted to comment that, after a few hours, I do start to notice this. For the cable, my goodness, this cable is from Viking Weave Cables. And I'm not going to comment on the sound here. I'm talking specifically about the ergonomics and the look, the aesthetics. I'm not a cable person. I don't care about cables. I don't get into cable memeing whatsoever. But Jesus Christ, would you look at this thing? And it's almost kind of in contrast to the more utilitarian vibe of the headphone. One other thing that is not talked about enough, this uses 3.5 millimeter connectors on the cup here, and they're sort of set inwards into the cup. And I think it's a really cool design because 3.5 millimeter connectors are not the most sturdy, and so having it set inwards like this increases their stability. If you think about like the way that people kind of plug things into this socket here, with other headphones, you're often plugging it in not at the perfect angle if it's just like straight down, but because these are set in, it kind of acts as a little bit of like a guide to plug it in the correct way with the correct angle right away. It's a nice touch. It's a small thing, but it's a nice touch. Now, for the juicy stuff, the power requirements. This is a headphone that requires an amplifier. The tungsten is both high impedance and low sensitivity. So I measured the impedance of this to be approximately 160 ohm for both channels with a generally linear impedance curve, and that's what you're seeing right now. And with an average sensitivity of 78 dB per milliwatt, this makes this one of the more challenging headphones to drive. So there's your HE6 comparison again. Now, with that in mind, in my opinion, the sort of mythical status of HE6 power requirements has been somewhat overblown. Like if you think about how things have changed over the years and sort of with the source equipment landscape and how that's improved, you've got amplifiers that are much more powerful at much, lower price tags. And also, these days headphones in general have gotten easier and easier to drive. So like the industry has changed quite a bit since those older days. I felt for a long time that these two sides of the industry have been kind of like, ships passing in the night, where like you're getting more and more powerful amplifiers at lower and lower price tags, and headphones are getting easier and easier to drive, making that entirely pointless. And in that respect, the Tungsten marks a return to that sort of old school ideology of ensuring that you have a discrete desktop headphone amplifier that can run it. But again, it's more of a question of how loud you want to listen. So for those wanting to listen at around 75 dB, you can probably get away with most good enough amps. But in my case, I'm also testing these. I'm testing the excursion limits. I'm testing these at much higher volumes. So running it from the HPA V550 made sense for me. And the same would go for if you want to run this at higher volumes as well, or if you want to get into EQ, you're going to need to make some additional considerations there beyond just the typical good enough amplifiers out there in most cases. Now, I know that a lot of people will be interested in whether or not their equipment can run it. And so I'm going to leave a link in the description for a list of amplifiers that should be able to handle it at various different volumes and at different price tags. And there's also going to be a lot of other folks who are kind of chiming in on this question as well. We've also got a headphone power calculator that I'll leave below as well. So that way, hopefully you'll be able to tell if what you have is good enough to get this, to the sufficient listening level that you may want, or what types of devices would be able to handle this kind of headphone. Now, for the sound quality, let's get into it, and I'm going to start by talking about the objective performance, and then we'll get into the subjective stuff afterwards. But just before I do, if you guys find this stuff valuable, consider subscribing. It's something that you can do that costs you nothing, and it really helps us out. So it would be much appreciated if that's something that you guys would feel inclined to do. So let's start by taking a look at the performance with the hybrid pads measured here on the B&K 5128. And I'll show you guys the Gross data as well. But for the 5128 data, for this, if you're looking at both the raw and the calibrated data, you can see how the headphone performs relative to the established range of listener preferences. If you're new to reading headphone measurements, there are a number of videos that we've already done on this that can help. But just so you guys get a sense here, it is generally better if things fall within the shaded area. So with the hybrid pads, which happen to be my favorite, the Tungsten has a presentation that I'd describe as warm yet balanced. So you do get perfectly flat bass extension all the way down to 20 hertz. And you can see that there is an emphasis to the lower mid-range, and this gives it a kind of rich and lush kind of sound. And there are some headphones where an elevation here causes things to sound muddy, since an emphasis to fundamental tones here can often mask the overall clarity that you might want. But I don't find that to be the case with this one. It seems to be balanced out quite a bit better by the rest of the tuning for the headphones. So it is that sort of warm, lush thing with the hybrid pads, but still balanced. And in fact, I'd say actually the mids are a standout feature on this headphone, especially for those liking their headphones to sound a little bit warmer and richer as well. So it is a little bit emphasized and it kind of comes forward in the mix a bit. You can also see that there's a dip there at around 2K, and this is not uncommon. Like you see this on a lot of the hi-fi man headphones, like the open backs, and you see this on the HD800S from Sennheiser. And I tend to find that this has a spaciousness enhancing effect. And so that is influential here as well. Now, one thing I especially like about the Tungsten with the hybrid pads is that the strongest part of the ear gain, which is this region here, while it's relaxed, it still has the right shape to it, meaning that the balance for the upper mids and the treble is likely to be both well received for instrument timbre, and also that it'll be versatile for a wide range of music. So if you have too much energy here, things can sound shouty or glary. If you have too little energy here, things can sound muffled. And with the hybrid pads, it's fairly safe. Right, so it kind of walks that line reasonably well, just a little bit on the relaxed side, because there's less distance here between the rise at 3 kilohertz and the lower mids, where that sort of thickness comes across. Now for the treble, there is a slight peak at around 9K. I personally hear this closer to 8.5K, but depending on the person, this feature is going to shift around a little bit, or it might not even show up at all. But interestingly, when you remove the grills, this feature goes away. Now, in saying that, I do not recommend removing the grills on planar magnetic headphones, categorically. Like, I've worked with planar magnetic headphones enough and taken enough of them apart to know that this is something to be extremely careful about. So my recommendation here, if you are bothered by that 8.5K or 9K peak, is to just EQ that down. Do not run this without a grill, because you will magnetize things that you don't even realize are, metallic and potentially damaging. Now, when it comes to the perf pads here, these add a bit more clarity to the presentation overall. So it creates additional distance between the lower mids and the upper mids and lower treble. But they also have the effect of sort of exacerbating some of the peaks in the treble. So, that feature that's around 5K, and then also the 8.5, 9K feature gets enhanced a little bit as a result of the perf pads. But as I mentioned before, the perf pads also do seem to change depending on the pad compression and the clamp pressure. So with a stronger clamp, there seems to be a more linear response throughout the mid-range, especially for the upper mids. And I actually only discovered this after having to bend the headband out for myself and then measuring again and then bending it back in and then measuring again and finding that is a consistent behavior change. So depending on the pressure. It's interesting. I just find this stuff interesting. I don't know how meaningful that's going to be, because if you have a large head and you bend the headband out to fit better, on your head, it's probably still going to have the better response. It's just that on a smaller head, if there's no compression, then the response it's not as good. And with the hybrid pads, I didn't notice this feature happening at all. In any case, I can see a preference for either pad. I think of it like this. If you want a more clarity-focused presentation, go with the perf pads. If you want a warmer, smoother presentation, opt for the hybrid pads. And I personally, again, prefer the hybrid pads for the reasons that I mentioned. I also like that there's a little bit better bass extension with the hybrid pads. And especially like if you're someone looking to EQ, I think it might be easier to EQ with the hybrid pads as well. But again, if you're looking for something that compares a little bit more to the hi-fi men planers like the HE6 or the HE1000, the perf pads are the way to go. Now, as mentioned, for those wanting to see how this does relative to Harman, here are the results as well. And this is again on Gross, but it's solid performance all around, in my opinion, with both sets of pads. And I just have to say that it's nice to be able to choose the sound signature based on your preference. Like, it's nice to be able to say, yeah, I want something warmer, I'm going to go with the hybrid pads, or I want something with a bit more clarity, I'm going to go with the perf pads. And then you can make that decision. Not everything needs to be exactly this, target. You can have something that satisfies a different preference group. That's fine. Now, there's one other thing I want to mention here with the frequency response, and it's that the Tungsten has a low resonance frequency with only minimal damping. And again, just like the HE6. So why does this matter? Well, for those who get an imperfect seal, say anyone wearing glasses with like really thick arms to them, you can actually get a bass boost down low. And you can see that here. And I like to show this with these types of headphones because there are other headphones that have more critical damping where the bass will just like drop off completely if there's a break in the seal. So with this one, there's no issues there. And I think that's a good thing. Now, for those wanting to get into EQ, the harmonic distortion for the Tungsten is also very low. Even when running it at super high volumes. So you won't run into any audible distortion products when you're listening normally, and it also gives you a lot of flexibility with EQ. If you want to add a bass shelf, you can do that. There does seem to be a hard limit at around 116 dB, but anyone listening that loud will go deaf quite quickly. And so, for even loud listening, it's not something that I'd be too worried about. So the bottom line for objective performance is that, while this is a headphone that by no means needs EQ, you can certainly still have all kinds of fun with that if you want to. It can handle it, no problem. And, for the rest of it, I think it's pretty solid. I only made a couple of subtle adjustments, and here you can see my EQ profile along with the result that I ended up with. And I think it sounds great. So that is the objective performance. How does it sound subjectively with music? And remember, what I'm going to describe here is only ever to do with the subjective experience. These are not descriptions of acoustic properties. I don't want people to conflate these descriptions. But in short, it does everything well. Everything sounds tight and well controlled. The instrument separation is exceptional. Like when you're listening to vocal harmonies, you can clearly hear the individual lines, for each vocal track. It's not claustrophobic or intimate sounding. It sounds reasonably spacious. There's no blunting for the details in music. You can hear everything kind of ring out clearly the way it should.
It is another headphone compatible with the Sonora cables, so that puts it up a
notch. Here, show me. Let's look at the. And interestingly, after reducing that peak at around 8.5K, the timbre is also solid. Like I mentioned earlier, that the ear gain shape isn't unlike what you get with other headphones that do well for that. And I think that is responsible for, how I hear this when it comes to, the naturalness of the presentation for instrument tones and things like that. So yeah, for the subjective stuff, it's just solid across the board. It's really good. But I mainly wanted to highlight that the Tungsten sound reminds me a lot of those more intense sounding planars of old. Again, like the HE6 or the HE500 even. And I know, again, that these are just descriptions of the subjective experience, but if you've had any, opportunity to listen to those headphones side by side, you'll kind of know what I mean, like the HE6 versus like the HE1000. So there's a kind of intensity to this one that I think a lot of people will like. As for what kind of music it goes well with, as I mentioned, the Tungsten is particularly versatile, so I think it'll do well with just about everything. If you listen to jazz, acoustic, and classical, you may want to opt for the perf pads, but I enjoy that stuff as well with the hybrid ones. It just depends on how you want that music to sound. But, when listening to Steven Wilson's Harmony Codex, for example, I found it to be more enjoyable with the hybrid pads, but I preferred it with the perf pads for the piano recordings like from Ting Valtrio's Beat, for example. So let's now compare it against some of the competition. And I've been comparing it to the HE6 throughout, so let me just kind of go through that as well. And remember that I use the HE6 with the Sundara 2020 pads because that dramatically improves the sound signature compared to the original pads that it comes with. And again, with the HE6, I'm talking about the original one here, not the HE6 SE. So overall, the HE6 is mainly just a bit brighter than the Tungsten. Like for the wideband tuning there, it's just a little bit more energy in the treble. So I'd say the HE6 has a more clarity-focused presentation than the Tungsten, especially comparing against the Tungsten with the hybrid pads. But the HE6 also has a more meaningful peak at around 9K, and that was more noticeable than the peak in that same region on the Tungsten. So when I was comparing back and forth, I noticed it more on the HE6. But really, I'd say the Tungsten is kind of just like a warmer HE6 with similar strengths across the board, and even some advantages. Now, compared to the Susvara, and again, it's a totally different price point, for me, the Susvara, it has a little bit more of that sort of unveiling quality, but it also has a little bit of excess energy at around 4.5K, which I do reduce on the Susvara compared to the Tungsten, and the Tungsten, I don't reduce that region. So I think for anybody who perceives the Susvara to be too bright or too forward in that, lower treble region, you'll have an easier time with the Tungsten. And I get that like not everybody has heard the Susvara, so maybe this comparison isn't that useful, but that really is the most significant difference between the two, especially if you're comparing it against the Tungsten with the perf pads. Another comparison would be with the Odyssey LCD4, and the Tungsten is just a flat out better tuned headphone than the majority of LCD4s. And I say majority because there are some that are reasonably well tuned and certainly more well tuned than others. But for most of the LCD4s that I've evaluated, that I've had a chance to listen to, they're quite dark for most of the upper mids and treble, and that's really where the Tungsten has a clear advantage. So again, with the hybrid pads, it's kind of like a more well-tuned LCD4. I didn't get the 8.5K peak on the LCD4, but that one I had to EQ so much more of it to get it to sound right. So with the Tungsten, it's a much more subtle EQ adjustment that I do. And I think these days, the strongest competition comes from the Meze Empyrean 2. And this is a tough one because there are things about each of them that I like. There are strengths for each of them. So subjectively, I would give the edge to the subjective performance to the Tungsten. For objective performance, it's kind of a toss-up between the two. Like, it depends on which part of the treble you're more sensitive to, whether it's 6K or 8 to 9K. But the Empyrean 2 is also definitely more comfortable to wear for the majority of the day. So I could really see a preference going for either one of those. And I know there's a need for many other comparisons with other headphones, particularly with the single-sided version. I would like to, at some point, get that in and just maybe continue that forum thread that we're kind of contributing to with other comparisons as we're doing them. But at the moment, I'm going to give a conclusion to this. So is the Tungsten any good? Well, very much yes, if you can run it. As usual, though, it's going to depend on the type of sound signature that you're after. I think the big thing to note here is that if you're looking for something that's got a more esoteric or more flavored sound signature, the Tungsten is less about that. So if you're looking for like a V-shaped or a brighter kind of sound signature, that's not this headphone. But something that's going for a little bit more of that balanced presentation, the Tungsten does a great job, and I think it's extremely competitive with other headphones that cost quite a bit more than this. The other consideration is that I expect it'll be a bit of a wait to get this one because they aren't readily available. So I don't expect this review is going to help all that much. So yes, like full stamp of approval for this one. I think you can get it with confidence, but it might be a bit of a wait time to be able to get it. But with that in mind, the Tungsten should be high on anyone's list who's looking for a great sounding planar magnetic headphone. Provided you have an amplifier to get the job done. But anyways, that's it for this review. As mentioned, we have a whole suite of measurements of this headphone up on the forum already with an ongoing discussion along with a list of equipment that should be able to drive it. So check that out if you're interested in that. If you'd like to chat with me or other like-minded audio folks, you can do so in our Discord. But until next time, thanks for watching.